So this is the third video lecture on David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. So of course, quick recap, the first two. In the first video lecture, we discussed Hume's argument that morals are founded on sentiment, so he defends moral sentimentalism. In the second video lecture, and he established, of course, that benevolence is that one trait which is universal, connecting all those other virtues that we listed. In the second video lecture, we saw Hume argue that justice is something which is conventional, actually. It's not natural, but it is entirely conventional. It is useful, and that is why we praise justice. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind his meta-ethical arguments here and the ways that he is differing with previous philosophers, and we'll see that, of course, throughout this lecture as well. But, for example, just like with Aristotle, right? Hume's ethics is not teleological like Aristotle's. So in Aristotle's ethics, for example, the reason why we do things is aimed at some end to bring that end about, and so everything is for the sake of that end. That is why we do what we do. Hume does not take that route. His ethics is not teleological. There is some similarity in that there is leeway, right? It's not like a rule-based ethics that we'll discuss later with, for example, Kant and John Stuart Mill. But he's definitely not, he's arguing different things, whereas, again, like the Stoics, would never have said that we could rely on feeling to determine what we ought to do. And of course, Hume is saying, no, actually, we ought to rely on feeling, on human sentiment. So, beginning with section 5. So we established, of course, that justice is useful, that what is useful appears to be good, praiseworthy. But why? Why is that which is useful praiseworthy? Why do we praise that? So, Hume, gives an example about this, where he says, a ship appears more beautiful to an artist, or one moderately skilled in navigation, whereas its prow is wide and swelling beyond its poop, than if it were framed with a precise geometrical regularity, in contradiction to all the laws of mechanics. A building whose doors and windows were exact squares would hurt the eye by that very proportion, that proportion to which it is, technically, I guess, right, the most useful, or that it's the most efficient. We can think of it that way. Why? Why do we praise things that actually appear, or we could actually blame, right, that building which is so geometrical in its proportions? Why do we not find those things useful, and yet we still praise those things, right? So why do we seem to praise things, but not, why do we seem to praise those things which are not useful, when we have reasons why, right? Because we find it tasteful. But then we also still praise things that we don't find tasteful, but simply are just useful. So Hume again takes up for a moment the considerations of the moral skeptic, who would argue that, of course, again, right, moral distinctions are not actually real, that between good and bad. So skeptics actually would argue, because, of course, we still think that there are, well, generally, I guess, anyway, right, that there are distinctions that we many times follow between, praising something and blaming something else, wanting to do and prefer certain things over others. So, of course, the moral skeptics have to explain that. And to explain that, they say, well, it's just because of education, right? We've been taught that certain things are praiseworthy and other things are blameworthy. Maybe it's propaganda. Politicians, of course, want a society to act a certain way because it can be beneficial to their rule. And so maybe that's, the reason why we believe that there are such moral distinctions. Now, remember that Hume, in the first section, argued against moral skepticism. But specifically against this argument of education, Hume argues against this because he thinks that, for example, the universal prevalence of moral distinctions in our human language, that we can go to all different societies throughout history, even in our contemporary life right now, all across the world, and we can find in language moral terms which seem natural. Why? Why in all these, even communities which, we could go find tribes which have not been contacted by modern civilization, they would still have moral terms in their language. A dualism, right, of good and bad. So, for example, he lists the words honorable and shameful, lovely and odious, noble and despicable, and so on. That those words are proof that moral distinctions are given in our human nature. Now, he does acknowledge, though, that there is some role, of course, for education, we could say, for building habit or custom, that since every being does have a strong connection with society, per the justice as utility argument, that all humans do become favorable, of course, over time we become habituated. Maybe we could say educated, although habituated, I think, explains it better. That we become favorable to those habits or principles which do promote social order, upon which, of course, if you remember, the protection of property is founded. So there is still, of course, a role for education and habituation. He doesn't discount that entirely, right? He's not arguing for one extreme in the entirety. Now, what he does have to argue against, though, is what is known as moral egoism. So to explain why we praise utility, of course, there are many different theories. And one theory in particular, especially in his time, which he finds to be troublesome, right, a competitor, I guess, to his own philosophy, is moral egoism, or that, as he calls it, the selfish theory of morals. So moral egoism says that people do only what is in their own perceived self-interest. So that doesn't mean that people are selfish in a way that, like, they always want to get the better of someone else and they don't care about anyone else. That's not the case. But it's that we are motivated by our actions first. So that actually it is indirectly good for society that we all seek our best interests, because indirectly, if we all seek our best interests, we end up being better people, and so society flourishes, overall, right? So there's a really famous 20th century person, not a philosopher, although people think she's a philosopher. Ayn Rand, maybe you've heard of Ayn Rand, was a moral egoist. She attempted to do philosophy, but she's not very good at it, I guess you could say. In the philosophical world, there's like Ayn Rand's like the punching bag. So you can Google Ayn Rand if you'd like. But there were actually in Hume's day some very famous moral egoists. So, for example, Thomas Hobbes, who lived 1588 to 1679, and I mentioned him briefly last time. He's famous for the state of nature theory that before government, that humans naturally are selfish and we take advantage of one another, and the state of nature is a war of all against all. But there's someone else who's a little bit closer to Hume's contemporary, Bernard Mandeville, who is famous for actually a book called, or a poem called, the book is called Fable of the Bees. You might be interested in this, actually. Check it out. The poem specifically, which the book was originally based on, is called The Grumbling Hive. It became so famous, actually, that afterward he ended up writing responses to people that would respond to his poem. And so this book contains the poem and then all his kind of philosophical justification for what he argues in that poem, which is a kind of moral egoism. And so again, right? Just keep in mind that the main argument of moral egoism is not that passion or action is entirely disinterested, right? That even, they would say, the most generous friendship is actually a modification of this self-love. Specifically with Mandeville, actually, to give you a taste of this, he argued that vices like competitiveness, envy, a passion for luxury, and ambition, so those different things we could say are vices, especially in extremes, right? He argued that those are actually qualities which indirectly promote the welfare of society. And so famously in his poem, The Grumbling Hive, when society magically, all those vices are done away with and everyone is benevolent, in that poem, Mandeville tries to argue that human society actually ends up collapsing because it was only because we were self-interested that we could enjoy the things that we do love in society. So it's a really interesting poem. Maybe I'll post it actually on eLearn if anyone's interested in reading it. Okay, so we have many different arguments Hume makes against moral egoism, but I'm going to list 4 in particular that I'm going to focus on. So the first argument against moral egoism is that he argues we can feel sentiments, we can feel, we have feelings of approval for adversaries or competitors who oppose our own personal interests. Why would that be the case if we, are just influenced wholly by ourselves? How could we have that feeling of approval for adversaries? He says, a generous, a brave, a noble deed performed by an adversary commands our approbation, while in its consequences it may be acknowledged prejudicial to our particular interest. So it could be the case that in a pandemic, for example, you are a political rival of, a governor or something like that, and why would you, of course, praise the actions maybe of that governor or whoever it may be, the mayor, president, if they are doing good things to combat the pandemic? Hume argues, well, we find cases where political adversaries would still praise those political rivals who, let's say an election is in a few months, it would seem that it's actually maybe not in their best interest to do so, and yet they do. So, let's move on to the second argument. Hume argues that egoism would argue that when we display feelings for actions that are distant in space or time, for example, from a story in the past, right, that we could be reading something from ancient Greece, and it could be a Greek tragedy, that egoism, for Hume, would argue that when we display feelings, right, we're moved by that story of Greek tragedy or whatever it may be, that we do so with the power of the imagination. That because remember, there's nothing in our self-interest that, like, being moved by a story of, love or whatever it may be, there's nothing in the past about that story that would be in our self-interest. So it's just we imagine that we were maybe contemporaries, and so in some way that would benefit us, and that's why we could have that feeling. Hume thinks that's ridiculous, that the imagination is not that powerful at all. So on the contrary, Hume argues that we do so not because we imagine the feeling of approbation, but because it's actually part of human nature to praise certain actions or characteristics. That these are things which are universal, as he tried to demonstrate when we had the list of things we praise and the things that we generally blame, right? And we tried to see if there was some characteristic that united them, and we said it was benevolence. And specifically, actually, this goes back to the Enquiry concerning human understanding, Hume's text on epistemology and metaphysics, where he argues that belief is actually rooted in sentiment or feeling. That when we believe, so what he means by belief, I should say, can be those things like the sun will rise tomorrow, because it's actually irrational that we make arguments that based on experience the sun would rise tomorrow. So this is part of the problem of induction. Hume has to explain, though, why we come to actually believe those things. And he says, well, it's rooted in our feeling or sentiment, that is the foundation of arguments from experience. So, again, this grounds his ethics, and that the power of imagination is not as extensive as belief, which is rooted in feeling or sentiment. It doesn't have that ability to move us. So imagination can't be the answer for that. And he says that it is but a weak subterfuge, when pressed by these facts and arguments, to say that we transport ourselves by the force of imagination into distant ages and countries, and consider the advantage which we should have reaped from these characters had we been contemporaries, and had any commerce with persons. It is not conceivable how a real sentiment or passion can ever arise from a known imaginary interest, especially when our real interest is still kept in view, right? Especially when, of course, we're reading those stories, well, we still are in contact with the contemporary world. And it is often acknowledged to be entirely distinct from the imaginary, and even sometimes opposite to it. And yet again, we can still have that feeling. It is just because for Hume, these things are universal, and they are rooted in our sentiment. Things like benevolence and compassion for others that might even be adversaries to ourselves, or that have no relation to ourselves at all if it's a story in the past. We still have those feelings because we recognize, for Hume, there is something naturally good about them, rooted in our human nature. So the third argument against egoism. Hume says that we can find cases where it might actually, so that first case, right, we can find cases where we praise adversaries or competitors. In this case, we find cases where it might be personally rational to be disinterested, to not care, because it might hurt ourselves. And yet, Hume says, we still find ourselves displaying approbation, right, praise or disapproval of certain conducts. So he says, what is that to me? There are few occasions when this question is not pertinent, and had it that universal, infallible influence supposed, it would turn into ridicule every composition and almost every conversation which contain any praise or censure of men and manners. So, for example, there are times where we might see someone, being abused or something like that, and we are moved, of course, by the pain suffered by that person, which has no interest to ourselves, and which, displaying that concern or feeling for that person, might actually endanger ourselves. And in fact, that sometimes we're moved to defend, and we would praise when people defend that person, especially if it was ourselves defending that person, when we could be risking our lives. And yet, Hume says, we can find cases where we are moved to do that, because it is just, we find those qualities to be things naturally and universally beneficial. And so the fourth argument against moral egoism. He says that even non-rational animals display benevolence. That if the egoists were to maintain that reasons make us selfish, right, that it is the possession of reason that we are rational beings, and so we see, we should only look out for what is in our own personal best interest, that they would still have to grant that it is nature first that makes us benevolent, since benevolence seems to be found in all other animals in the world, non-rational animals. And that therefore, Hume says, the moral egoists would at least have to establish the universality and the nature of benevolence. So he says, animals are found susceptible of kindness, both to their own species and to ours. Nor is there, in this case, the least supposition of disguise or artifice. Shall we account for all their sentiments, too, from refined deductions of self-interest? Or if we admit a disinterested benevolence in the inferior species, so we say, no, animals, too, are disinterested. By what rule of analogy can we refuse it, then, in the superior, in those beings which are supposed to possess reason? Hume thinks it doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. And so there are some cases where people will argue, well, your animal, like your cat, for example, only displays affection towards you because they really just want to be fed, right? And so they know that, like, oh, if I cuddle up to you, then I know that you, my owner, will feed me, and I want to be fed, right? I hear people argue that, of course. I assume you do too, maybe. But humans say, and yet we can find cases where other animals comfort those other animals in distress, maybe. Or I'm sure we've seen where, like, one animal takes on an entirely different animal of a species that's not the same and will nurse it back to health or something like that. That we see, animals when another one dies, that animal suffers as well for recognizing in some way the loss, right, of that animal. And that we see cases too where, like, maybe certain pets are friendly to, like, the kids in a family, but it's not the kids that feed the animals, it's the parents. So why would the cat want to be friendly to the kids when the cat doesn't maybe get anything but torment from the kids wanting to always play with the animal, right? So humans say even then, right, that the selfish argument doesn't hold up even with non-rational animals. So, back to that original question which section 5 begins with. Why does utility please? Why do we find it that we praise those qualities which we say are useful? His answer is that we approve of utility because the principle of benevolence is part of human nature. That utility, what is useful, promotes the happiness of others, which is something we just instinctively care about. That we can actually, of course, root out, we can, through training, get rid or quell that, but we're at least born with the capacity for benevolence. Now, this again doesn't mean that benevolence is something unlimited, because, of course, well, we have justice and we find justice useful, and remember, he argued that if we had unlimited benevolence, then we wouldn't need justice. It wouldn't make sense for it to exist. So for Hume, actually, self-interest and benevolence are actually kind of two sides of the same coin. That human benevolence is not, of course, unlimited, but that both benevolence and self-interest actually are present in human nature, and they serve to limit each other. And so, of course, it would be better to determine which cases, maybe are more useful to be self-interested, and which cases are more useful to be benevolent. But that, of course, still the main argument is that benevolence is universal and natural, and that we are not wholly moved by self-interest, as the moral egoists argue. Okay. So that concludes the fifth section, why utility pleases. Hume begins the sixth section listing. So what we've done basically is the first section is an introduction where he says, he sides with moral sentimentalism as opposed to moral rationalism, and of course moral skepticism. But then sections 2 through 5, actually, what Hume has been developing is an argument describing the ways in which qualities are actually useful to others. So we have benevolence, gratitude, friendliness, truthfulness, justice, fidelity, honor, allegiance, chastity, charity, affability, lenity, mercy, and moderation, just to name a few, which Hume says are qualities, right, that it is praiseworthy for, we would say, individuals to have this based on the way others approve of those. So those are useful for other people to have, including our own from the view, of course, of others. But in section 6, Hume begins then to develop the argument for qualities that are useful, so those virtues, that are actually useful to ourselves. And then in section 7, we get qualities agreeable to ourselves. And finally, in section 8, before the conclusion of 9, we get qualities agreeable to others. So some qualities that are useful to ourselves are discretion, industry, frugality, caution, strength of mind, wisdom, good sense, temperament, judgment, patience, order, sobriety, and secrecy, among others. I do want to read a few of these cases that Hume lists, and the reasons why he says, actually, we praise these qualities that are useful to ourselves. So, for example, this is page 121 here. He says, the quality the most necessary for the execution of any useful enterprise is discretion, by which we carry on a safe intercourse with others, give due attention to our own and to their character, weigh each circumstance of the business which we undertake, and employ the surest and safest means for the attainment of any end or purpose. So we have, for example, on page 122 here, paragraph 11, he says, but all prospect of success in life or even of tolerable subsistence must fail where a reasonable frugality is wanting. The heap, instead of increasing, diminishes daily and leaves its possessor so much more unhappy as, not having been able to confine his expenses to a large revenue, he will still less be able to live contentedly on a small one. And one more. We'll look at, so paragraph 13, page 122. He says, qualities often derive merit from complicated sources. Honesty, fidelity, truth are praised for their immediate tendency to promote the interest of society. But after those virtues are once established upon this foundation, they are also considered as advantageous to the person himself, and as the source of that trust and confidence which can alone give a man any consideration in life. One becomes contemptible, no less than odious, when he forgets the duty which, in this particular, he owes to himself as well as to society. So of those qualities that are useful to ourselves, Hume argues, he actually maintains that these, what we could call private virtues, those qualities useful to ourselves, that these private virtues are actually more arbitrary than the social virtues. That the social virtues are more foundational and consistent, but that private virtues are actually more subject to context and degree. That there is, again, this was the similarity I was talking about to Aristotle a little bit, that there's a degree in which we praise these things, right? That in some cases, honesty might actually not be praised in one time and a place as compared to another when it would be praised more. But nonetheless, it would still be praised, he thinks, even in that case where the degree would be required less. So he says of this, particular customs and manners after the usefulness of qualities, they also alter their merit. Particular situations have, in some degree, the same influence. He will always be more esteemed who possesses those talents and accomplishments which suit his station and profession, than he whom fortune has misplaced in the part which she has assigned him. So there can be cases where we might say there are some virtues we might praise that are useful to ourselves, so these private virtues, but that maybe you're kind of born in the wrong time, and it just so happens that like at this time that you live in, a certain culture doesn't praise that quality as much, right? I can think of one, maybe doesn't quite align up, but I think of like opera singing, right? Like one might be born to be have a great talent in singing in the opera style, but it's not praised as much as it maybe would have been in the past, right? Even though we would say it's a good quality, that it could be useful to a certain style of music, right? and so useful to yourself in, I guess, getting a job or something like that. Now, even though these private virtues, these qualities useful to ourselves, Hume argues, are more arbitrary because they're subject to change more, or matter of degree than the social virtues. Hume still says that private virtues are actually less liable to doubt and controversy. That actually, even he thinks the moral egoist, is still, or even maybe the moral skeptic to some extent, if they say, well, this is what we're taught, that these are things which are actually more readily accepted, right, to be things that are praised. So he says, temperance, sobriety, patience, constancy, perseverance, forethought, considerateness, secrecy, order, insinuation, address, presence of mind, quickness of conception, facility of expression, these and 1,000 more of the same kind, no man will ever deny to be excellencies and perfections. That even, again, that, people are more apt to just say, like, all those traits he just listed are good, whereas they might not say certain things like benevolence or some of those other social virtues are as good. So again, he wants to make sure he defeats the moral egoists. So about these so of course we were discussing why utility pleases, and he thinks the moral egoist can't explain that. But why these we praise these private virtues, these qualities that are personally useful, he still thinks that self-love or moral egoism can never determine those advantages possessed by others as being good for ourselves, because of course, well, we don't want, if I'm just solely motivated by my self-interest, why would I want, again, potential competitors, adversaries, to possess those qualities which actually might be harmful to myself? That according to egoism, I should prefer others not actually to possess those qualities personally useful, since they should run up against me. Right? Why should I praise, for example, sobriety? Well, maybe my competitor might get more work done, and that might be bad for me. Why should I praise perseverance, for example? All those things might actually be to the detriment of myself, and yet, Hume says, we still recognize those things as praiseworthy. Therefore, virtue requires the praise of others when they possess these good qualities, even when it is not in my self-interest, maybe, to do so. Right? Why would I feel good about your temperament or frugality, if not for the fact that we are not led purely by self-love and egoism? It doesn't make any sense. So I want to end actually with this quote on page 126 here, towards the end of section 6, where Hume, I think, really kind of puts the nail in the coffin for, at least according to him, for moral egoism. So Hume writes, whatever conduct promotes the good of community is loved, praised, and esteemed by the community on account of that utility and interest of which everyone partakes. And though this affection and regard be, in reality, gratitude, not self-love, yet a distinction, even of this obvious nature, may not readily be made by superficial reasoners. And there is room, at least, to support the cavil and dispute for a moment. But as qualities which tend only to the utility of their possessor, without any reference to us, or to the community, are yet esteemed and valued, by what theory or system can we account for this sentiment from self-love, or deduce it from that favorite origin? There seems here a necessity for confessing that the happiness and misery of others are not spectacles entirely indifferent to us, but that the view of the former, whether in its causes or effects, like sunshine or the prospect of well-cultivated plains, to carry our pretensions no higher, communicates a secret joy and satisfaction, the appearance of the latter like a lowering cloud. That it is just innate within us for this capacity to praise these virtues. Because, of course, again, morality is rooted in sentiment, but more than that, there are qualities which are natural, and for example, that is benevolence, and so on. So here's a good discussion question, I think. Can you think of an argument in defense of this philosophy of self-interest? Right? Do you think maybe Hume sold moral egoism short here? Can you think of good reasons why we might want to argue that we are actually more motivated by what is in our best self-interest? And that doesn't mean, again, selfishly in the sense that, like, we take advantage of others, but that, like, so I should say, actually, if one is interested in the history of this, I recommend checking out books like the famous sociologist Max Weber and his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, or even, and I'll mention this actually when we get to Nietzsche, so we can see maybe like a Nietzschean response to Hume. But another one would be, if you're interested in, so the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is a famous sociological work about the origin of that Protestant ethic of, frugality and working hard and kind of that working just to continue to work to make profit and so on. So this is supposed to be an answer to some extent for the origin of capitalism. And if you're interested in these ideas, actually, like Bernard Mandeville, especially, but even Hume, about the role that this argument of self-interest or just even moral sentiments played in what would be maybe that Protestant ethic, or we could call it now the capitalist ethic, I guess. If you read the book, you'd understand why it's the Protestant ethic. But there's a really good historical work if you're interested in like what ideas led to those qualities which capitalism praises. And this is one here by Albert Hirschman called The Passions and the Interests, Political Arguments for Capitalism Before Its Triumph. So I'll actually return to this again later with Nietzsche when we talk about genealogy. But to think about that, right? Can you think of an art, and I think there may be many, right, which at least we're probably instilled into ourselves certain self-interested traits that we might say are good. How do you think Hume would respond to those, maybe arguments in defense of the theory of self-interest, moral egoism? Does Hume ultimately convince you that the moral egoists are wrong? So I'm really interested in what you think.